If you were to ask me, and you are watching this video, plant identification is more of a technique than it is a strict science. Like fluency in a language or learning to play an instrument, it gets easier the more you do it. With that said, however, things can be pretty intimidating when you approach them as a beginner. There are a lot of plants in the world, and they all tend to look the same on first blush. If you're starting out as a forager, factoring in your own health and well-being can raise the stakes in interesting ways. It's an age-old question. Will this go well in a salad, or will it systematically destroy me? But, as the saying goes, we all start out as beginners. So as a show of transparency, I'd like to tell you about one of the first plants that I identified, and the absolute ringer I put myself through trying to identify it. Maianthemum is a genus of herbaceous perennials in the asparagus family. It's undergone something of an identity change in recent years. For a long time, these were classified under the genus Smilacina in the family Liliaceae, but recent genetic intel has made reclassification necessary, such is the way with APG. There are two species native to my area, Maianthemum stellatum and Maianthemum racemosum. I'm not one to pick favorites, but I prefer the latter. These plants go by an unnecessary wealth of mostly interchangeable common names. Among these names is Solomon plume, Solomon seal, and Mayflower. The first two are unnecessarily biblical references to morphological traits. Solomon plume refers to the plume-like flowers of Maianthemum racemosum, and Solomon seal is sort of an oblique reference to Maianthemum stellatum's rhizomatic root structure. If you want a more in-depth explanation of why they're named this, you'd best contact a theologian. And I feel like I've missed something. But what could it be? Shit! Okay, so Polygonatum is a genus of plants in the lily family, broadly distributed throughout Asia, with some members frequently grown as garden ornamental plants. They are known by their common name, which is Solomon seal. And I'm a level with you. I've never seen these plants before in my life, which I think makes the fact that I forgot about them kind of acceptable. But I still feel the need to mention them, not only because the nominal confusion makes me want to scream, but also because, unlike their charismatic imposters, you can't eat these. They will hurt you. And to be fair, I don't think there's too much of a danger in confusing these with Maianthemums. First of all, if you're going to find them, you'll probably find them in a garden and not a wild environment. And second of all, visually speaking, they are noticeably different from one another. But just let this be a lesson not to trust common names. We're not ornithologists, we're botanists. If we're going by common names, though, I personally most prefer the name Mayflower, because it actually makes an effort to describe something of its subject. And that, of course, being its seasonality, the fact that it tends to flower in May. Maianthemum, of course, literally translates to Mayflower or May flowering. Where I live, it's often late May to early June when they produce these tufts of small, otherwise inconspicuous white flowers. These flowers rely on a variety of small pollinators, and the ones I've most often read about are tachinid flies. But the insect activity I tend more often to see have been ants. An unconventional pollinator, to be sure, but, they'll do in a pinch. The first time I encountered this plant, I was something like 18 or 19 years old, with only a beginner's foraging guide and no other knowledge of local plants. I first ran across them in, I want to say, the middle of June, when the flowers had already been pollinated and they were all just beginning to set fruit. And this is a pretty fortunate time to find them, because if there's a spot in this plant's life cycle where it's most identifiable, this would be it. You see, the unripe fruits of Maianthemum stellatum have a very interesting pigmentation to them, like each berry's been bound in 3 distinct purple straps. This is a very distinctive trait, and it makes identification a cinch if you're anyone but me. See, the thing is, when you're just starting out, or even in instances where you have a lot of book smarts that you haven't really put into practice, you often tend to get in your own way. Like, I basically had a positive idea on this the moment that I saw it, but the fact that I intended to eat it, coupled with a whole season of opportunities to second-guess myself, drove me nuts every time I walked past the thing. In my defense, this isn't a baseless fear. Mayflowers have some notorious lookalikes that make misidentification into a dangerous and possibly fatal undertaking. The two most notorious lookalikes for a plant like this are death camas and baneberry, both of which are very dangerous but also have some pretty obvious attributes to the trained eye that eliminate them from serious misidentification concern. The death camases are monocots, so they most resemble mayflowers on the outset, but they tend to flower much later into the season, and those flowers ripen into three-lobed capsules, not berries. Baneberry, on the other hand, produces these racemes of red berries that closely resemble those of Maianthemum racemosum, but they're dicots which stand on average a foot or two taller than mayflowers and have much more complicated leaf structures. So after a couple months and more hand-wringing than was ever truly necessary, I finally came to terms with the fact that I was right. Not long after, in early to mid-September, the berries of my local plant were finally ripe enough to try. Maianthemum fruits are presumably most adapted to avian dispersal, with a red to purple pulp with one or two proportionately large seeds per fruit. Maianthemum racemosum produces large clusters of berries that taste much sweeter, while M. stellatum will produce a couple or more berries that taste, Okay, so one of the many common names for this group of plants is treacleberry. Now, I've never had treacle before. Does it taste like eldritch honey? Because that's how these taste, vaguely sweet but well beyond mortal comprehension. It's a maddening sensation, and every year I find myself returning to my local plants just to try their berries and see maybe if I got it wrong the past 4 or 5 years or just had a long continuous stroke. But no, that's just how they taste. And I think that's a particularly salient lesson for a lot of new foragers, that just because something is edible doesn't mean it's palatable. It doesn't always taste good. It requires some preparation. As for these, I'm still trying to figure out how to prepare them to make them taste not the way they do. I'll let you know if I ever find anything, but I'm doubtful.